of Judges closes with these somber words. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Those words conclude what is a very dark chapter in the history of the nation of Israel, especially if you get into the latter part of the book of Judges and you read about some of the stuff that was going on during that time period. It is just as ugly and scandalous as any period of history, of their history that you can read about. It was extraordinarily dark days. In fact, it makes me wonder if there's more to this statement than what we appreciate. I mean, we read that and we assume that it is a comment about the political situation in Israel. During this time, they were not ruled by kings, and that's certainly true. That wouldn't come later until you have Saul and David and Solomon and so on. During this period, God would use judges, deliverers that he would raise up periodically when the people would get themselves in a mess, and he would bring up this deliverer to come and to rescue them. And in that sense, there was no king in Israel. Or is that true? Because I think there was a king over Israel. The king was supposed to be who? Jehovah. He was supposed to be the king of Israel. And so when I read that, I can't help but wonder if maybe what is being said here is that not even God was king at this time. Now, I'll tell you something, brothers and sisters, that when men get to that place where the king is no longer ruling, then they've got to come up with some other method for figuring out how they're going to behave themselves. And so what this verse tells us is that during this time, people just essentially did whatever they wanted to do, what they decided was right in their own eyes, because there was no king whose rule they respected. And so when I read that, I have to tell you that I think about our times. That you and I are living in a day where people no longer respect the rule of the king. In fact, the truth is, growing numbers of people in our culture don't even acknowledge that the king exists anymore. And so what I want to say to you is that when you no longer believe in the king, when God's rule is no longer respected, you're going to have to figure out some other way to behave, right? Some other way for deciding what's going to be right and what's going to be wrong. And so in our culture today, we see that happening all the time. As people try to figure out which way to go, they come up with different ways of deciding what is right and what is wrong. And so I want to wander down that path with just a little bit with you, and then we'll get to the text in just a minute. So hang with me for a second. Not going to go too far, but I just want to go a little way. If you don't respect the rule of God, how do you decide what's right and wrong? How do you decide how to behave? Have you ever thought about that? Some people use what I would call a pain standard. You see where that's going? Some people decide right and wrong this way. When confronted with a moral choice, they ask this question: well, will this hurt anybody? Ever heard someone say that? And if the answer to the question is, I don't think I'm hurting anybody, then that means my conduct is morally right. So to illustrate that, years ago I was reading this newspaper article about this guy that was stealing people's checks and cashing them. And the police were hunting for this guy. They were trying to run him down. And evidently he'd gotten hooked in with a media source, and he was sort of taunting the police that were looking for him. And one of the things he said to them was, why are you guys coming after me? He said, why don't you go after the real criminals like murderers or rapists? After all, it's not like what? It's not like I'm hurting anybody. Now, right there, we begin to see one of the problems with using pain as a way to determine morality. Pain can be sort of in the eye of the beholder, right? This guy that's ripping off people's checks and cashing them, he doesn't think he's hurting anybody. I'm guessing if he stole your check, you'd feel differently about that, right? Have to clean up that financial mess that he made? I think I'm being hurt by that. That's a problem for me. You see the problem? And what happens when the pain associated with our choices isn't immediate? Sometimes we do things that only wind up hurting later on. So here's a 17-year-old kid, and he's going to decide to smoke a little dope because, after all, it's not like I'm hurting anybody. That's what he says to himself. But are you sure about that? Could there be long-term impacts on a person's body because of that? They didn't even know about that yet. And then the other thing I wonder about, how did he get that dope to smoke in the first place? Does anyone really believe that criminal enterprise that begins with manufacturing and then delivering illegal narcotics to people, does anybody really believe that nobody gets hurt in that process? Do we not listen to the news? Maybe there's pain there that he doesn't even see. Do you see what I'm talking about? When people just work with this question, well, am I hurting anybody? That's not really a good way to figure out right and wrong, is it? It's a flawed standard that people use all the time. So maybe we go the other direction, and instead of worrying about pain, maybe I'm just going to worry about happiness. And sometimes in figuring out right and wrong, people go this way too. You know what I'm going to say, right? If this choice I make, when faced with a moral decision, with this decision, if doing this will make me happy, then it is morally right. Do you see it? People do that all the time. So here's a college student, maybe in her third or fourth year, and she's been out with a boy, and she ends up pregnant. And that is not convenient to a third-year college student. She realizes my plans are going to change dramatically if I have this child. I'm not ready for that. I can't support this child. And so she says to herself, I'm going to terminate this pregnancy because I have a right, what? To be happy. People think that way? You see, that's using happiness to determine morality. More often than not, we hear people say that about divorce, right? I have a right to be married, and this marriage, or I have a right to be happy, and this marriage I'm in, it is just making me miserable. In fact, sometimes they invoke God, and they say, God would want me to be happy, therefore I have a right to divorce my spouse because I have a right to be happy. But you have the same kind of problem you have with happiness that you have with pain, just only working backward. Sometimes, brothers and sisters, what we think will make us happy in the moment is not what will make us happy long term. And the two examples I've used are classic examples of that. A lot of people think getting an abortion or getting a divorce is the thing in the moment that will make me happy. But you map that out 5 or 10 years, and an awful lot of those people, by far the vast majority, look back and say, that was not something that made me happy. That was something that I deeply regret. But that's not the only problem with using happiness to determine morality. What happens when the thing that will make me happy doesn't make you happy? Have y'all been to Finner's Garage? He's got some cars out there that would make me happy. In fact, if I could just go get one of them and I didn't have to pay for it, I could just get it and have it and drive it. There's a word for that. Stealing. If I could just do that, I would be very happy with a couple of cars driving those around out there. The problem is, you see, my happiness would probably not make you happy. Yeah, you see the problem? So what happens when my happiness collides with someone else? It is a flawed standard, brothers and sisters. Just asking what will make me happy doesn't work. And so someone says, we need to get more people in this, so let's do that. Some people, when they decide about morality, what they do is they just look at what the survey said, right? And so if I can get most people to agree with me that something is morally right, then that would make it morally right. And so we are a nation consumed with polls and surveys and the outcome of those surveys. All the time, thousands of us are being asked our opinion about all kinds of things. So where are you on gay marriage? And what do you believe about abortion? And for a lot of people, the outcome of those surveys are very, very important. If we can get over the 50% hump, maybe 52% of the people will say this is morally right. Well, then if most people say that, then it must certainly be true. And so we determine morality by what the survey says, right? I just wonder, is anyone really willing to live with that standard? that anything that a majority of people in a given country decide is right is then morally right? We really want to be there? What we need to do is go back through some history before we jump on board with that, right? Because, folks, there's a lot of things in this country and in other countries in the world in centuries gone by that everybody said was okay, that you and I today would say, that is not okay. I don't care how many people thought that was right. It isn't right. How about slavery? How about racism? How about what happened in Germany in the 40s? Go on down through the list. Or what if we look to the future? I want you to imagine that 50 years from now, you could take a survey of American opinion, and at least more than half of us would say that it was okay for parents to murder their newborn infants within the first week of life if they, for whatever reason, decided they just didn't want the baby. Now, some of you are thinking, come on, David, that's an extreme example. That would never happen. Are you sure about that? Because I promise you, there are people sitting in this audience with gray hair or no hair who can remember 50 years ago, and you never would have imagined that we would be sitting here today talking about whether or not you could choose your gender in America, okay? And you never thought we'd be talking about abortion on demand or gay marriage as a sacred right in this country. So don't be so sure how much things can change in 50 years. You with me on that? You see that? And unless you doubt that the possibility is out there, do you realize that already there are voices saying that? James Watson, who was a Nobel laureate, noted for his work in the discovery of DNA, suggested that infants should not be declared alive until 3 days after birth so parents could dispose of defective newborns. Do you hear that? So now we're not talking about whether or not we can do it. Now we're just quibbling over a time period. Professor Michael Tooley at Stanford University argued, listen to this, that there is no morally relevant biological difference between a fetus and a newborn. Do you hear that? By the way, that's what we've been saying all the time. There's no difference between that little 2-day-old baby and that baby 2 days before birth in his mother's womb. That's what we have argued. And now someone says, hey, that's right. And so what he goes on to say, thus any defense of abortion is also the defense of infanticide. You see what he's saying? If we kill that baby 2 days before he's born, what's a couple more days, folks? So, 50 years. You can get at least 52% of Americans to say, I think it's morally right to kill a 3-day-old baby if mom and dad decide for whatever reason they don't want it. Is that going to make it morally right? See the problem? Folks, the fact that you can get a bunch of people to agree together that something is right doesn't make it right. Is a flawed standard. It doesn't work. I tell you ultimately where I think folks are going to wind up with this. Ultimately, they're going to wind up exactly where they did in Judges, and that is everybody just sort of uses a personal standard. I think our country is largely willing to say that with most moral questions, everybody's just got to decide that for themselves. In fact, that's what we hear all the time. There is no absolute truth. There is no absolute morality. Everybody's just kind of got to decide for themselves how they ought to behave. Y'all hear folks saying that? In fact, that's where this language, don't judge me, comes from. Underneath that is this idea that there is no absolute truth and everybody just has to figure it out for themselves. The problem is nobody really believes that. At least not about everything. Because everyone's going to come along and say, well, a lot of morality can be personal, but not all of it can. For example, we're going to say that about killing people, right? You don't get to make your own choice about killing people, or freeways in Houston would be death zones, right? You don't get to make your own choice about that. We're going to draw a bright line in the sand and say, everyone has to agree with this rule that you can't kill people. The problem is, why are we drawing the line there? Why couldn't it include more than that? Or why include that? And the more fundamental question is, who says the line belongs there? If there is no king that rules over us. There is nobody in a position who has a right to make the rules for everybody. And you know where we are? Judges 21:25. Everybody does what is right in his own eyes. Let me tell you this morning, there are two problems with that approach to morality. Let me start with the most basic one. The most basic problem with that approach to morality is it doesn't respect the rule of the king. So I want you to go back to Genesis 1:27, where we spent a lot of time last year. I know I've made this point before, so I won't dawdle over it, but it needs to be interjected in this part of this lesson. Genesis 1:27, God made man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. What does that tell us? We are the creation of God. And one of the things we said over and over again last year is that tells us more than just something about where we came from. It defines a relationship. It says God is the creator, I am the creation. What does that mean? He has a right to tell me what to do. He has a right to lay down his law with the expectation that you and I, as his creation, will do what he said. In fact, he's going to hold us accountable to this law. Now I'm headed to the New Testament. Head to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. This is 2 Corinthians 5, and I'm looking down at verse 10. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10, Paul says, "For we all must appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad." And so we have a date scheduled before the king to answer for how we have lived our lives before him. In fact, back up to Matthew. This is at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, and I'm looking down at verse 21. Matthew 7. Look at verse 21. After giving all this teaching, Jesus is now pressing his crowd to listen to him and do what he says. And to emphasize that point in verse 21, he says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." Do you see the authority in those words there? You have to do what the Father said. Why? Because he's the creator. It goes back to Genesis again. "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name cast out demons? And in your name perform many miracles?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me,'" listen to this, "you who practice" what? Lawlessness. There is a law given by the Creator that men are supposed to adhere to and behave, and yet some of them don't do that. They are without law. They are lawless, and it is not going to be good for them when judgment comes. I will not be prepared to face the Lord if I don't listen to what his law says. Brothers and sisters, all that is wrong with our culture today comes back to this point. Men and women do not respect the rule of the king. We think what is wrong in this country is about who sits in the Oval Office at the White House. And I know that's what some of you think because you can't stop saying stuff about it on Facebook. You're fighting the wrong battle. This is not about who's elected president, brothers and sisters. This is about who's sitting on the throne in heaven. And the fact that men no longer, I know y'all were out there today, men no longer respect his rule. What we need to do is quit fussing about politics on Facebook, and we need to start exalting the king, encouraging people to get back and respect his rule in their lives. Okay, I fussed about that today. We're going to try to do that a lot throughout this year. Second problem with these standards is they haven't served us well. How has it worked out for us as a nation as we have rejected the king and begun to do our own thing, whatever we think is right? How's that working out? The time it will take us to conduct this service, 70 teenage girls are going to be pregnant. Statistic. By the time the sun sets on this day, 4,000 unborn children will be slaughtered. Because the survey says abortion is acceptable. There was a story in the news a few years ago about a woman who had a date and nobody to babysit her infant son. And so she dressed for her date, and as she headed out to meet up with this young man, she stopped by the river. And she threw the child in and went and met her date. If you will go back and read the end of Judges, those are the kinds of things happening in Israel. That's what this abandonment of God has gotten. Are we better off because we've stopped respecting the rule of the Creator? I would argue that these new ways of figuring out right and wrong have not helped us. And so what we need to get back is to the rule of the king. But I'm going to tell you, brothers and sisters, if there is a king in Israel, if there's a king that rules in your life and mine, we operate with a completely different set of questions. And I want to wrap up with 3 of those before we go this morning. People who respect the king, when they're trying to figure out right and wrong, the first thing they ask is, well, what did Jesus say? Do you realize that a lot of the most controversial moral questions of our day are actually easily resolved if we just ask that question? Well, what did Jesus say about that? In fact, let me give you a couple of examples. Head over to Hebrews 13 for a minute. Hebrews chapter 13. There's a lot of controversy in our culture today about whether or not you can have sex before you get married. In fact, by and large, that moral line is gone anymore. Pretty much everybody's going to sleep around before they get married. But is that morally right? The king said something about that. In Hebrews 13 and verse 4, through the Hebrew writer, he says, marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. Where is God on this business of having sex before you get married? God says, I don't want that. That is a violation of my law. You do that, you're acting lawlessly. And by the way, it brings a lot of the grief and the sorrow that comes when we don't listen to what the king said. So that issue is pretty easy to clear up, isn't it? How about all this controversy over homosexuality? Head over to the book of Romans. I'm in Romans 1. I don't know that we have a more controversial moral question in our time than whether or not homosexuality is acceptable behavior. And the king weighed in on that too, through the Apostle Paul in Romans 1 in verse 26, where Paul writes, for this reason God gave them over to degrading passions. Underscore that phrase in your mind. God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function, underscore that phrase, for that which is unnatural. In the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing, here it is, indecent acts, and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. You know, there are a lot of passages that speak to homosexual behavior. I just don't know one that's a whole lot better than what it says right here. Pretty clear what he's talking about, no doubt about that. And he's pretty clear about how God feels about that. He calls these degrading passions, and frankly, he just says it's behavior that's unnatural. And anybody who has an ounce of knowledge of human anatomy knows that is unnatural behavior. It isn't the way things are supposed to work. And then he warns at the end of 27 that there's a penalty that comes with that conduct. You can clear away all this controversy about homosexual behavior because the king has weighed in and he has spoken plainly about his will in matters like that. How about being a little bit of dishonest on our taxes so you don't have to pay so much, right? Ooh, that's a timely subject. Y'all working on taxes yet? Because it is coming like a hurricane in the Gulf. It's coming, right? Can I just hold back from reporting a little bit of that income so I don't get killed by the government on my taxes? Colossians 3:9, King said something about that. This is Colossians chapter 3, and in verse 9, he said, do not lie to one another, since you laid aside the old self with its evil practices. There you go, folks, it's right there. Lying is part of the old man, and we killed him, Romans 5, when we were baptized into Christ, right? He's dead. I'm sorry, that's Romans 6. He's dead. We can't live that anymore. There's no more lie. You see, a lot of these moral controversies, they just go away. They're easily resolved when we just ask the question, what did the king say? And sometimes what we find in Scripture is he just plainly identifies what conduct he's unhappy with or what conduct he wants us to do, and he just sort of lays it out and spells it out for us. So disciples will ask this question, what did Jesus say about that? But that's not the only question we need to ask ourselves, because not every instruction from the Lord comes in the form of a specific statement about a specific behavior. Sometimes it's like that. Don't commit adultery. That's a specific statement about a specific behavior. But sometimes God communicates his will in the form of a principle that he means to be applied. And so a second question disciples will ask is this: are there any principles from the king that would help me with this decision that I'm wrestling with? Can I illustrate that for you? So go to John for a minute, John 13, and look down at verse 34. This is John 13, verse 34. Jesus said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another even as I have loved you, that you also love one another." So, there's the instruction from the king. I want you to love people. Now, how many applications does that have? Can you think of any? Like 1 or 2,000 just sitting here right off the top of your head? And that's the point. That's a principle. And what Jesus expects us to do is to dig into the principle, because notice, when he says we're supposed to love people, he defines what kind of love that is, right? He says it's the kind of love that I have for you. And so you and I are supposed to kind of dig in and find out how he loves us. And once we figure out what the principle means, then we start applying it to our lives. I've got to figure out every place in my life where that idea fits and should govern my behavior. Do you see how that works? That's the application of a biblical principle. And sometimes, brothers and sisters, God guides us in the decisions we make by giving us principles that we're supposed to study and apply. So again, let me give you some examples of that. I'm looking at Philippians chapter 4, if you would go there. Philippians 4 in verse 8. I love this passage. It's one of my favorite ones. Philippians 4:8. Do you know this one? Where he says, "Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is good repute, if there is any excellence and anything worthy of praise," what are you supposed to do? Think on these things, dwell on these things, let your mind dwell on these things. And so the king has something to say about my thinking. What kind of thoughts I want to entertain and run around in my mind. He wants those to be things that are holy and honorable and true. And so I'm just wondering, when I get my mind around that principle, can you see any applications of that? Do you think that would have any impact at all on what we watch on television? Or what podcasts we're listening to? Or what we're reading in a book? Do you think that this principle would influence those kind of choices that we make? That's what it's supposed to do. We could go over this morning to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, where God says that godly women are to dress modestly and with discretion. You know, God didn't give our ladies a buying guide for Macy's. It's not like I can go over into 27th chapter of 3rd John and find a list of everything I'm supposed to buy and not supposed to buy. It isn't there. In fact, there are no guidelines as far as length and cut and tightness. You know what God said? Dress modestly. Show some discretion. Choose with the ability to blush at the thought of showing too much or wearing something that would cause somebody else to lust. And with all those thoughts in mind, go buy. Go choose. I think some disciples behave as though God didn't say anything about how I dress. I can just dress however I want to. That is not so. King did say something about that. How about Titus 2, verse 12, where he talked about how we live in this present age, among other ways, with sobriety. Self-control, some translations said. The idea is that as we live our life, we have a clear head and strong self-discipline. and the ability to make wise choices. That's a principle. Influences lots of decisions, like the decisions we make about alcohol. This requirement to live a prudent, self-controlled life, should that not impact the choice someone makes to drink something that robs you of all that stuff? It's the application of a biblical principle. Do you see that, folks? Sometimes that's how God tells us what it is that he wants us to do. I think sometimes disciples are not very good at this second step of the process. I think we like to say, well, God never said anything about that. Are you sure about that? Are there no principles in his word that would lead me and guide me to make a wise choice? Because I tell you, folks, when I ignore the principles that I'm supposed to be using, there's no king in Israel. I'm not listening to the rule of the Creator. And listen, whether I believe it or not, two terrible things are going to happen. Number one, I'm going to have to deal with him on these parts of his word I'm ignoring. And number two, I'm going to suffer the mess and calamity that comes when I don't follow the rule of the king. You see that? And so when people are really interested in honoring the king, they don't just ask, well, what did he say about that? They also ask, well, are there any principles here that could lead me and guide me? And then thirdly, people who are interested in the rule of the king, they also want to know, well, what would Jesus do? I love this one. After all, we're supposed to be like Jesus, right? Matthew 10 and verse 25, it is enough for the disciple that he become as his teacher. And so I think sometimes morality gets real simple when we just ask, would Jesus do that? I got to be careful here, because to use that principle requires something of me. I can't do what I think Jesus would do. People do that all the time, right? They just decide who they think Jesus is, and then they just sort of make it up as they go. That's doing what we want to do. No, you got to get in the book and you got to know Jesus. That begins this whole process. And so I got to learn about him and what he said and how he lived. And the more and more I come to know Jesus, which is what our Bible reading is all about, text talk at 5 o'clock today. I got an announcement in the middle of the sermon. Once I figure out who he is, then I can begin to say, okay, but what would he do? What is his will? And sometimes I think that simplifies the process. You know, it's real easy when we really want to do something that we know we shouldn't do. It's real easy to find a way to justify that in our mind. And what I love about this question is that it kind of cuts through all of that, doesn't it? You know, you stop and you ask yourself, would Jesus go there? Could I see Jesus saying that to someone? Would he watch that? Would I watch that if he was with me, which he is? And if the answer to those questions is no, I can't really see Jesus doing that. That really doesn't fit who he was and what he taught. If the answer is no, then it probably needs to be no for me too. Because more than anything, I want to be like him. And I guess that's where this all ends up, folks. Is that really what we want? I think there's a reason that in Judges and in America, everybody does what is right in their own eyes. I think that's exactly what they want to do. And so the question for me and you is, am I in this for me or am I in this for him? Because I promise you, if at the bottom of all of this is I really want to do what I want to do, I will always find a way to do that. But if my goal is to please him and to live a life that brings him honor and glory, it's a whole different thing, isn't it? And so let's get to the heart of this morning. Is that where you are today? Maybe there's someone in the crowd, as we've talked about all of this, what you realize is that your struggles at the very heart of it is that you haven't really been living for him. You've been living for you. And maybe we can help you do something about that. Maybe for the first time you need to choose to serve him, or maybe you need to come back to him because you've been doing your own thing and away from him for a while. Listen, he wants you to come home today. We want to help you in whatever way that we can. So if you need to respond to him, you can make your way to the front right now while we stand, while we sing.